Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's session about keeping your System Security Plan, or SSP, up to date and audit ready. The presenters today will be a special guest, Jerry Leishman, and myself, Scott Armstrong. First, a few housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is scheduled to last 45 minutes to an hour, including Q&A. All participants will be muted to enable speakers to present without interruption. A large portion of today's event is going to be dedicated to answering pressing questions that have come from the audience in advance. So those will be going through after we do Jerry's initial presentation. In case of an outage, please wait for a minute and refresh the page. We've yet to have that happen, but we always do that as a cautionary recommendation. For your convenience, there's also a link in the YouTube description to a glossary of commonly used terms and acronyms. Sometimes, when we get into these government compliance programs and whatnot, we start using acronyms. If you need a reference, go there. It is being recorded today, so this webinar will be available on demand from our resource library as well. And if you'd like to speak to one of our industry experts, request a copy of the slide deck, reach out to us about how to work with partners like Jerry or any of our product solutions for SSPs and policies, just reach out to us at cmmc-team@exostar.com, or you can use our live chat feature on our corporate website at exostar.com as well. So a quick agenda. I'll go through some introductions. We'll have Jerry present some information about SSPs, why they're important and why you really need it. And, how do you maintain it, update it? How do you improve it? How do you really get audit ready? And why is it important to really maintain the SSP as a living, breathing document, especially as you go through the process, if you're reporting to the DoD on a DoD assessment score, why you should keep those kind of in tandem. And then we'll go through the Q&A questions that have been submitted in advance. Again, the speakers, we've got Jerry from CORTAC Group and myself, Scott Armstrong. I'll do a quick overview of Jerry. We're very pleased to have him with us today. He is considered an expert in this area and highly active in the CMMC community. I know he supports one of the accreditation body standards working group. That's the group that has helped create the assessment guidance for how to go and do the assessments on a control or practice type basis. He's a provisional CMMC level 1 through 3 assessor and a registered practitioner, and his firm is deep in the middle of a lot of activities around this. Jerry, on this front, I'll hand it over to you and we'll go through some of your slides and you can discuss the topic about the SSPs. The one thing I will mention, there is an exit poll today. We're going to ask that you do this by the end of the session. It'll be down in the YouTube description as well. We take that feedback for guidance on, how we can improve these sessions, what other topics you might want to hear, and things of that nature. So Jerry, on to you.
Great. And just welcome everybody. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Exostar, for having an opportunity to come speak and share what I know. This is really an educational opportunity for me to, and Scott, which I'm looking forward to doing Q&A and just bringing the latest and greatest around CMMC and maybe even some of the Biden executive order and some of the recent changes you've seen in the critical infrastructure area because of ransomware changes, just driving more cybersecurity regulations across not only the federal agencies, but critical infrastructures protect our national security, economic advantage, and our military focus there. So this is kind of a broader thing. So I'm going to talk more than just CMMC. For example, a system security plan, depending on the context, if it's a FedRAMP or if it's a CMMC or if it's a DFARS, all of these different acronyms have different meanings and there are different regulations that we're going to talk about. But the system security plan that Scott brought up is kind of a core capability of how you define, document, and communicate the information about your internal systems to your customers and regulating bodies. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. Not only how to get there, but how to stay there. As Scott says, it's an ongoing living document. As your environment changes, so does the document. So it's we'll talk about that. Can you go to the next slide, Scott?
Sure.
Just a little bit about CORTAC. We're national. As Scott mentioned, I'm active in the CMMC environment, helping more around driving adoption of cybersecurity across the Department of Defense suppliers, the defense industrial base, as you may know it. But we also work with a lot of the larger companies. We do a lot of work with Microsoft, some of the manufacturing extension programs in the Pacific Northwest, like Impact Washington, who are taking grant money in from the DoD and NIST to help distribute that and manage that across local businesses in that state to help them improve their cybersecurity and compliance posture to not only meet kind of the CMMC level requirements that are coming their way, but DFARS and other sort of data protection and government's requirements just to protect the information, their intellectual property that they have, not only for themselves, but their customers. So it's a very broad set of conversations and set of customers that we work with, from the primes all the way down to the two-person machine shops. So I have good experience understanding the challenges of doing the documentation in this case with focus, but even coming up with the right size, cost optimized solutions that are maintainable and supportable, so you can get compliant, as Scott said, audit ready, and then maintain that through the life of your organization. It's a living, breathing thing as we move into the next era of security and compliance, and get there, stay there. So can you go to the next slide, Scott? So this is kind of a journey slide. So it talks a lot about a lot of things. But the first and foremost thing is, before you can make any investments, informed investments in your organization, you really have to discover and understand where you're at. So we use the term as a readiness assessment to really understand your risks and obligations. And as many of you know, if you're working with government agencies, they like a lot of documentation. And documentation in the cybersecurity world for the DoD specifically is a system security plan. You'll hear that. And then within a system security plan, there are plan of actions and milestones, which are actions to mitigate any gaps that you may have against a baseline. And with CMMC and DoD, it's usually the NIST 800-171 regulations, 110 cybersecurity controls. That is the baseline. That is kind of the minimum bar to start. Any folks that have DFARS flow down clauses in their contract know that they actually have to, as of law, as of November 30th, report a SPURS score to the SPURS system, which is a supplier risk supplier system. And that tells you basically a score based on some scoring criteria around those 110 controls that the DoD wants to know your security posture. So you actually are reporting to the DoD and being accountable for the information that you're sharing. However, that is just the start. It's just kind of an assessment. That's not a system security plan, but you've gone through and effectively have assessed yourself and come up with that score. But when they ask you for a system security plan, it's much bigger than just a score. So again, it's a maturity that you as an organization go through. But the system security plan is the all-encompassing plan. But you also hear about policies and procedures and other sorts of supporting documents, an incident response plan. All of these things are documentations that are required if you have controlled and classified information or ITAR information. And in the future of CMMC, you'll be audited against all of this information. And the auditor will come in and see that all the documentation you've created, that your organization has actually embraced that in their culture, their day-to-day operations. And they use the term institutionalization, which means it's not sitting on the shelf. It's actually observable. You've got demonstrated the evidence. It's in your policies. So that's why it's a maturity model with CMMC. It's about having the documentation well understood based on your environment, and that your people are following it, and ensuring that you have good cyber hygiene at the end of the day. So that's kind of the gist of why a system security plan is involved. It's kind of the context of all of that, with lots of other supporting pieces of documentation. So during your readiness assessment, and I'll put on my assessor hat, coming in and say, okay, do you have good documentation? Yes, no. If you don't have good documentation, or if you don't have an SSP plan, the auditor is going to say, well, let's stop the audit right now, because if you don't have a good, solid SSP plan, they can tell you haven't done your due care, your due diligence, and everything else is not going to matter. So the SSP is the key document that an auditor will go to see how clean your house is, or how well it's in order. So one of the examples that I've used a lot is, if you are taking your car into an auto shop and you walk into one, you see stuff all over the place, cars, pieces everywhere. I kind of get concerned about the confidence this guy's going to actually be able to deliver with quality, on time, and within my budget. But if I go into another shop where the floor is cleaned, everything's put away, I suddenly have assurance, or a feeling of assurance, that this guy has his act together, and I have more confidence that they're going to do the job. So I don't get worried about the details because they've taken care of the broader set. So your SSP is what communicates initially to your assessor, or to even your leadership, about, do you know what's going on in your organization? So, so if you look at what an SSP is, I mentioned it's just a single document. And there's been questions: is there a template about the system security plan for CMMC? And for the answer for CMMC is no. You can't go up to the DoD site and look for the template for CMMC level 3. But what you can go and do is get a NIST 800-171 system security plan template. So what most folks, or most of our customers, do, they start with NIST 171 because it's the base to everything. And then they build on additional practices and processes on top of that for the CMMC level 3 as they move through that maturity. And as we all probably know, none of those audits have actually happened yet, because there's no CMMC related contracts out there that have gone out for RFP and that have been awarded with criteria that you got to be certified, because there's nobody certified yet, because we barely have a couple C3POs that can do the audits. So there's still that big backlog that we can talk about later. But for the NIST stuff, they'll come in and look at your system security plan. They'll look at it and go, okay, it's sufficient, you're good. Let's look at some of your policies and observe it. On the system security plan, it's got basically three components. First is you got to describe the system. They call that the system environment. And if you take a step back, you go, well, what does that mean? Right? It's usually your internal systems. It's your suppliers or your tools that are being used to store your sensitive data. And I'll just use, controlled and classified data. CUI in the CMMC terminology. Could be anything from technical information or design information, anything you store, transmit, or create that's considered sensitive, that if you lost it, the business impact would be significant, or for your customers or yourself. So CUI. So the first thing you do as an organization is you got to know where the data goes, right? From sales to shipping. And so as you assess that, you define the boundaries of what systems, people, and process that touch that data, because this is all about securing the data. Things that don't touch the data, that's not CUI, nobody cares about, that's out of scope. So it's only the boundaries of your internal systems that touch the CUI data. So that's just it's a scoping exercise. Once you've done that, you can define what your system looks like. So an auditor can come in and say, okay, have you described your system well? That's the first part of the SSP. And that becomes the guidelines that they're going to go do the assessment against. And they're going to poke holes at it. Say, hey, well, I noticed over here in our interviews that we saw that you use Salesforce.now and you have some technical drawings stored up there as attachments. That's not reflected in your system security plan. Oh, well, that's an exception that some of our people did. They didn't follow process. Well, that now is part of your boundary. And that, dismisses what you've got in your system security plan because you didn't accommodate that. So you really got to make sure that system boundary and that description is really defined around where that CUI goes. Because if you don't have that right, nothing again else matters. So assume that you have that. So you got your boundary, you've done your due diligence, watched the data flow through your organization, you've validated that, the tools, the people, and the processes. So you've got a good description. You've written it out, you got some pictures. Great, somebody can look at it and know it. Then you move into the actual set of requirements. And there's, for CMMC level 3, there's 17 domains, 130 practices, which you consider controls, and each one of those will be assessed with objectives. So access control, one of those is two-factor authentication. There will be a line item in your system security plan that says access control. I don't remember the number, but you've got two-factor authentication implemented. Got three choices. Yes, it's implemented. No, it's partially, or no, it's not, or it's somewhere in the middle with partially implemented. So you will categorize that. And then within that, there's an opportunity for description for current state and future state. So you're trying to communicate that this is what I have today. I've implemented it, or I'm partially implemented with my current state, but here's my future state. So there's also got a future state. So here's where I'm going to demonstrate that I'll be sufficient for access control two-factor authentication. That gap between current and future state, where you've made a business decision on what tool you're going to implement. So you got to make those decisions first. So you have that future state. Then that gap is what they call a plan of action and milestones. So it's all the work activities you need to do to move from your current state to your future state to ultimately achieve 100% compliance. That all of your 130 practices for CMMC will be sufficient, because as most of us know, the DoD says there are no exceptions to the rule. Everything has to be implemented. You have to be 100% compliant for you to get your certification and award. So that gap goes into a list of plan of action and milestones, which are just, you can think of those individual projects. That could be, hey, I got to write a policy for two-factor authentication implementation for bring your own devices. That could be a policy. It actually could also have procedures, and that would all roll up as actions you have to put in and build as part of your system security plan future state. So it's very tactical, very detailed. But at the end of the day, you get through all of that. Now you can say, hey, here are the 40 things that we need to do to get audit ready. And then you can go to your leadership and say, hey, these are the solutions we want. This is the work. It's going to take about 6 months, $50,000. So now you've got an implementable plan based on the work you've put in your system security plan. And that's great. Now you've got something you can effectively communicate and get decisions made by your leadership about why you need to do this. Because if you don't get your cert, therefore you don't get your business. So there's definitely a business risk that you're mitigating to justify a revenue stream. That's the the system security plan. You build it and then you have the POAM. So then you say, okay, great. What do I do as I implement these solutions to fill those gaps? If I finish one of these POAM items, what do I do next? Well, it's an ongoing living document. So as you knock off, let's say you write your policy and your procedures for two-factor, you implement that, people start following it. Well, you go in and say completed. So you update the POAM as completed, and then you go back into your system security plan and say current state is now equal to my future state. So, and then you change it from partially implemented to fully implemented. And so you continue to do that and work it as your projects are completed. And that's why you have to have somebody that's managing your system security plan, keeping it up to date. The other part of that, as you update your system security plan, you can update your SPURS score back to the DoD, because you're continually improve your cyber posture. And you want to keep telling the DoD how you're improving, because it gives you more opportunities right now to win more business and seen as a low risk provider, which is good for everything as you move toward your CMMC 100% compliant. So you'll just continue to revise that, update it, and then hopefully at the end you get all of your POAM items mitigated. You've got solutions, they're implemented, and now you're saying, hey, the current state is equal to my future state. I am audit ready. All of my controls are sufficient to pass the audit. They're institutionalized. I've trained people. Auditor comes in, checks the SSP. Hey, it looks good. You got it all in scope. I did some observations that you're following two-factor authentication on your tools as well as your devices. Yep, we recognize that. It looks like what you said you're doing, you are doing. I've seen the implementation of the tools. You got the right evidence. Boom, you get the check mark. You get the certification for CMMC level 3, and now you're eligible for the award. You get the award, which is great. Now you have to maintain all of this for the next 3 years, because that's the commitment, is the compliance program. Is as your systems change, like you might buy a new package or technology package, or you may do a merger and acquisition and bring in a new business, you have to continually update the system security plan, because it's always the current state of your business. Because you could have a DoD DibCap guy just drop in for fun to visit your facility and say, show me your SSP, and say, hey, I don't see the update for the M&A that you guys just did, because they're Russian owned and we got some risks there. So you got to make sure that that's updated, right? You got those sort of things happening all the time, unexpectedly. So that system security plan always needs to be updated and reflected with the current system environment. Now, as you go through, you're going to identify new things that will be POAM items. Some of those will be big, others might be just operational. But you just, it gives you that list to continue to work with. And you need a compliance program management office, basically, to make sure all the right ones are being prioritized with impact and meeting upcoming audits that are coming. So you need somebody to manage that documentation and the entire program. But again, it all starts with that SSP. The POAM tells you how far you are, and then that's all supported by your policies, your procedures, which have to be updated as you add new tools, because the procedures are step by step how the business uses the tools to implement the controls. So any environmental changes your maybe not so much your policies, but your procedures, because that's what their auditor is going to look at. Are the procedures being followed by your resources? And if you got tools that aren't in the procedures, but they're using them on the floor, the auditor's going to go, why are you using a tool that's not in a procedure? So you got to keep all of this stuff all synced up and moving and maturing. It's a living document as you move forward. So that was a lot about system security plans, but that's the core and most important thing that you as an organization should assign somebody to take care of that and manage it through its life cycle to make sure you stay secure and compliant along this journey, wherever you're at in your maturity. So let's go to the next slide, Scott. So when we work with customers, there's usually 3 areas of gaps, which you can consider those plan of actions and milestones that they have to figure out solutions for. And as we know, the DoD has been kind enough to say, you can define any solution that works within your organization, but it needs to be sufficient in terms of meeting our requirement. So in some environments, to say technical solution, you want to get the data out of a file server in somebody's closet on a facility. You want to move that up into the cloud, into an Azure Gov, FedRAMP certified cloud service provider. Well, you got Microsoft and AWS. They don't tell you which one to use. You can choose that based on your business strategy, your current technology stack, and you know that you're transferring that risk to 2 tools that have FedRAMP High or FedRAMP Medium, and that's sufficient. So you're good to go there. You transfer that risk and you're buying that service from those suppliers. So you can have choices for each of the gaps based on what you want to do. Do you want to hire an FTE to manage your cybersecurity, or do you want to transfer it to a Microsoft that has a huge army of those folks? It's up to you. Either choice is fine. It's just, it comes back to your business strategy. And it's not a technical decision anymore, because there's lots of solutions. What's the right data governance and protection strategy for your company? And that's really what you're trying to define here. But documentation is always an area that people just lag behind. As we all know, you get busy working on solutions, you move on, you forget to go back and update your documentation. The government likes documentation, so you've got to go back and secure that and lock that down and make sure that's kept up to date. Technical solutions, lots of choices. Exostar is a great tool to help you build, policy development and procedure development, manage a variety of different aspects that are part of a CMMC program. So they're a great choice. When you get into the compliance space, you have to do incident response, you have to do vulnerability testing, risk management sort of activities. Some of that's tools, some of that's people, but it's really part of an ongoing program of doing work with the DoD and most likely with all the federal government, as we've seen the adoption of CMMC across the federal and down to critical infrastructure. So it's something you can't run from. You might as well embrace as an early adopter and go win more business, because it's just how we do business in this next generation with connected to the internet. So those are the 3 key areas that we typically see where remediation work happens. And as you implement and mitigate, you just keep the system security plan updated, you update policies, you update procedures as you implement these new technical solutions or compliance solutions. And next slide, Scott. Oh, I think that was all I wanted to share about the system security plan. Scott, any questions come in, or do we have any other ones that we'd like to address?
Yeah, we've got a few questions that have been submitted in advance, and I'll run through a few of these. Some of these I think you might have already covered well, but we'll see.
Sure.
And some of these I might chime in after you give a response. So the first question is there any idea when there will be official scoping guidance available for CMMC? And this would be, I guess, guidance from the DoD that would probably flow through the accreditation body.
Yeah, and I do know that they're still assessing some of the feedback from the other model. And Scott, maybe you can help me here. I'm not up to date on all the dates because I don't think they've been announced. So those dates, as far as I know, are not on the calendar. We expected it a long time ago, but Things still continue to be postponed for a variety of reasons. But I know they're close, and they're incorporating the supplier feedback. And after the review from the Biden administration, they may have some additional changes that will lead to model changes and then the appropriate assessment guidance that'll come out to organizations seeking certification, like the folks on the phone, as well as going to the provisional assessors to understand what they should be assessing against. And hopefully those two things come together so we have no surprises during the assessments in terms of what institutionalization means, what requirements mean as sufficient requirements for a level 3 for two-factor authentication. Those things have to align, and it has to be driven out of policy and process out of the DoD. Otherwise, people interpret it and come up with solutions that may not be sufficient from an auditor's viewpoint. So there's we'll need a few trial runs through that process and get alignment with the assessors and companies based on what the DoD is telling us and the AB.
Yep. Yeah, I had heard about 2 months ago from the DoD a comment that they were targeting this summer for the scoping guidance. I haven't heard an update, and I think all the factors that you brought in between the Biden administration doing, the 30-day review, getting through the initial assessors and getting that, I could see it being delayed a little bit, but I do know that there's a lot of pressure on the DoD to help get that scoping guidance out sooner rather than later. But again, we don't have a firm date on that.
No.
Um, so here's a question. It's kind of a technical one, not too technical, and it's really for looking, I think, at an enterprise, so not a cloud solution. Can I use a hardware appliance to separate the main network and the CUI network in such a way that the primary network is out of scope?
Well, I mean, it really comes down to you follow the data. So if you
Yep.
have CUI flowing from sales to shipping through people, process, or technology, then that is within your boundary. If you got hardware that's not carrying ITAR or CUI data, then you can segment that out of scope. But that's the easy answer. If you've got CUI flowing to your BYOD devices, then those devices are effectively within scope. So you need to have policies and procedures to mitigate where you want that data to go. And that's always the best thing to do first. Look at the data flows and say, hey, wow, that goes everywhere. Let's constrain that down to a smaller system, and then we can do our assessment and manage against that versus, systems that are peripheral but still have CUI. So that's job number one for you all is, as you follow your CI, how can we re-engineer this to mitigate the footprint where that CI is stored, transmitted, or created? That'll save you a lot of time, money, and aggravation over the long haul.
Got it. So here's a question which you've gone into it a little bit, so I'll rephrase it a bit. It's about understanding the difference between an SSP, um, policies, and procedures. And I think procedures is one that might be the most opaque for some people because there's not necessarily templates out there from the DoD or the AB. But from an assessor's perspective, what have you heard that people are looking for specifically for procedures as it relates to when they get audited?
Yeah, I mean, bottom line is the documentation says people are doing this, but I've observed they're doing something different. Like if they're doing a particular workflow, like doing a manufacturing a part that's sensitive, right? They said that the data comes in on through a CAD system, and then it never leaves that. But then you see somebody taking a USB stick, putting it in one machine, and then taking it over to the other side of the factory, sticking it in. Suddenly you're going, well, gosh, people are doing different things than what they should be doing. So that's a high risk area. That means that you're not following procedures. That means it's not institutionalized. The way I look at it is procedures are actually what you would train people on, right? You bring them in and say, here's step by step how to do a particular function. That particular training should be based on the procedures that you've established in your firm to do that part based on your policy and the tools and systems that you have. If that deviates anywhere between there in terms of observing by the assessor, then they're going to raise an eyebrow and assess, why is it different? And it could be, we have a temporary worker in there and they're doing something because one of the devices are broken. So at least they'd have a reason, but they'd also have to demonstrate that the data is still protected.
Yep. All right, here's a question. This I think, gets concerned with an SSP maintaining it, but also all the evidence that's needed to be prepared to go through an audit. Is it acceptable to store our records of compliance with the controls in a separate location, such as a database, or should we keep it all in the SSP document itself? And this is where they're thinking keeping them in the SSP leads to numerous updates as minor things change and whatnot. And I'll let you answer, then I'll give some personal thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's documentation management, it's content management. People have different ways to do it. I like to keep my SSP as clean as possible because that's a core document and they're going to get 80% of what they need out of it. If you load it up with lots of evidence and lots of other things, then it gets too hard for the assessor or somebody to look at to really understand your posture. So I would put in or create a separate secure environment for storing your evidence or logs, whatever that you have to support your mitigation approach that's available if the assessor wants to look at it, but it's more for your due care and due diligence for your internal staffs. The auditor may random sample something, but I don't believe it needs to be in the SSP directly.
Yeah, and I'll do a call out to our certification assistance solution because it's designed to help automate the maintenance of the SSP and generation of it. And it includes the links to all the evidence. So that's where, you still can regenerate, an SSP with a click of a button that eases the maintenance. But let's say your evidence is in a central store, in a SharePoint site or some other location, you just put the URLs in there and it's all linked together. So the more you can use automation, whether it's our tools or other things to help maintain it, it eases the burden. If you're doing it all with spreadsheets and Word documents and not tying it together, there's a lot of manual work to keep those linkages in place that will put you at risk unless you're using some types of tools or automation to help link it together.
Yeah,
Just my personal opinion there.
no, Scott, I mean, automation is a mandatory thing because, I mean, you could be changing this thing daily. You might have multiple people in there changing it because they have different ownership of domain areas. And it's got to always be kept up to date as systems are changed or processes require evidence to be captured. Having a tool is almost mandatory. I'll call it a GRC tool. Otherwise, things are going to get out of whack, and then the assessor comes in and it's not well put together. It's kind of like the auto shop where stuff's all over the place. It doesn't tick and tie, and suddenly you're on your heels. So it's better to have some sort of an automation system to reduce the cost and the management of keeping that set of documents up to date, easily acceptable, generation on demand, reporting to your SPURS score. All of those things are really, really important because it is a very manual task. Documentation is very manual, so you have to put context management around that.
Yep. All right, I've got a question. It looks like this is from a commercial firm that also does federal business. And probably if you could answer it from a security perspective, but then also from kind of the CMMC or 171 audit perspective.
Okay.
So the question is it necessary to have a SSP for every system in operation, or can an overarcher one be used? We've got several ways in that we operate as a business, depending on customer needs. And I can tell that it crosses over, commercial versus federal and DoD.
Right. Yeah. Again, it comes back to, your system boundary or your CUI boundary. It's going to cut across people, process, technology. It may even be physical locations. May have multiple data centers handling it. Those sorts of things need to be reflected so an auditor can know, okay, I need to go check the processes at data center A and data center B because they hold CUI. Now that may be one person in HR to talk to about how some of that data is handled, or maybe I have to look at two different people. All of that is so important because it sets the boundary of what the auditor is going to go look at and how they're going to attack the problem. So many larger organizations have data that sits both, or CUI data that's in their commercial systems that's used for both the DoD. There's some interesting challenges with that if the data is not classified as CUI versus commercial data. Now you look at an environment and they may go, we don't know, by looking at data if this is DoD related or commercial related. So suddenly you have to decide, well, if we don't know, we have to assume that it's DoD, right? because if it's not, then you're failing. So there's some issues with just doing data classification up front. If you haven't done it, it's something important to do. So you can better manage your data and separate it out and have less footprint that you have to ensure is compliant. But with the difference between the DoD work and commercial work is there are different level of expectations that you have to manage. So you may have to have one person only work on DoD and other people work on commercial if they're not a US citizen, for example, or US person. The data may be in different systems, but the function is the same. So it comes back, where's that data? And whatever system touch that data is within boundary, and that's what you'll have to secure around with policies and procedures and tools that are making sure that they're sufficient with two-factor authentication, for example. And it's not, sometimes it's not an easy problem to solve. And it's data protection and governance is job one. How do you manage your data through your organization? Then you can put tools around it to enable that through automation. But if you don't do the data protection piece, the tools can't fix that for you. And then you got to deal with it with people, and that gets expensive, and there's lots of opportunity for mistakes. Somebody doesn't classify a piece of data correctly, suddenly they send it out in email, and now you've got ITAR data floating out through a commercial 365 system. Now you got to just report that to the DoD or Department of Justice. It gets ugly pretty quick. And then they come visit you and say, hey, what else are you doing if you're not doing this well? There must be other things, right? If you catch one fish in a pond, there's got to be others. So they think a lot like that. So you don't want to be the first fish caught.
But I'll put my own perspective on it. This is from a security perspective. If you've got commercial operations versus say the data flow for CUI that's contained, you're probably going to have different procedures in place in those two things.
Mm-hmm.
You might be able to share IT policies if it's structured the right way. Technically, do you need, an SSP on your commercial side or other environments? You might say no, but if you want to protect your IP and your truly increase your maturity level as an organization, it is a good practice to be able to, if you can't document it, it's tough to say if you're actually doing it or not or knowing it. So it's a good practice, even if it's not required on the commercial side.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, if you can have one set of policies and processes in your organization, you have a lot less risk of, dropping the ball, misclassifying. But I understand to move everybody into a more secure, robust security process and posture, it affects end users in some cases. So you got to balance user impact versus the risk of spillage and the potential cost if that happened. And that's where, split companies that have commercial and defense, they have to make that call. Do we move everything into the higher secured DoD set of policies and practices and impact our users, or do we try to manage it through a split? Those are the key business decisions that have significant impacts across the organization that leadership will be needing to make over time. And having one SSP for the company is a lot easier than having multiple ones.
Yeah, it definitely, the smaller enterprise you are, I'd argue the same thing. Keeping it a single thing makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Here's a question from an FSO. Is there a list, and it might be where to go for this sort of thing, for how cloud spaces like GCC High or AWS or somebody like that might satisfy SSP requirements?
Sure. Microsoft is probably the most robust there. There are some blog posts and some documentation on their website and a product and a toolkit they call the CMMC placemat that maps the CMMC controls to the Microsoft products and the coverage that you get from buying the Microsoft licenses. So that's the Microsoft CMMC placemat or accelerator. So I would go to there first if you have Microsoft products. AWS has some documentation out there for infrastructure that you also can find, and we might be able to get those links out later. I don't have those top of mind, but those would be the two that I would know, around the two largest cloud service providers that folks are working with.
Yeah, and that's where generically, if you're talking to any cloud provider, you should be getting it from that cloud provider themselves. Most of them, if they have significant initiatives underway to be able to help drive that sort of information, starting with placemats, but then, you know, where they have shared controls, or they're doing the control on your behalf, so that you can be able to document that appropriately. So that's where you've got to go to the person that's selling that service, without a
Yeah.
doubt.
And one, just to add to that, one of the big questions still outstanding to the DoD is reciprocity. So if you have a cloud service provider that's not Microsoft, and they've got a secure environment, and they've got a FedRAMP, you know, authority to operate at a medium level, can you or do you get credit for that? You know, in terms of sufficiency. If you've done, I don't know all the reciprocities, but there's still some more information to come that says if this reciprocity will determine if some of your existing systems that you have will be sufficient if the DoD does allocate that reciprocity. So keep an eye out for the reciprocity conversation. And if it doesn't, then you've got a decision to make. Do I stay where I'm at, where I don't have reciprocity or it's not sufficient, and have to move to another environment where it is? And the answer is yes, you need to figure that out, because the auditor is going to say, do you have it within your boundaries tools that sufficiently protect the CUI? And if your current ones don't, then you need to find a strategy and make a migration to a tool that does.
Yep. All right, I've got a couple of questions I'll lump together. One is asking about, you know, SSP templates, and I know you already answered. You know, NIST has got one they did for 171. I've got one that says, what about POAM templates? And then I've got
Yep.
one that says, what about templates for doing the same thing but CMMC level 3? And I'll let you do your perspective, and I'll add some 2 cents with what Exostar's our take on it.
Correct. Yeah, under it's nist.gov, csrc.nist.gov. They've got a system security plan template for NIST 171. So if you're doing DFARS today and you want to get started on your SSP, which you should, to do your scores, you fill that out and you got 110 controls done. They have not issued a CMMC level 3 or level 1 equivalent system security plan or a plan of action and milestone template. However, you can just use those NIST and just add the additional control areas that are in CMMC level 3 and just use that same format. That's what I've been doing, because there's none out there by the government yet. There will be, but it's just not there today. So start with your NIST 171 plan of CUI plan of action and CUI SS template. And I have those links, and I don't know if I can drop them into a dialog box, but I'll send those to you, Scott.
Yep, and I think we've got some resources up on my Exostar with some of those templates.
Okay,
And
then we're good.
I know, yeah, in consulting with DCMA about their experience when they go and did some early audits, because officially there's like, in the commercial world, you can create your own template, so to speak, even though NIST has that one out there. They say the more you can standardize and follow that basic format, the easier it is for the auditors to do it, rather than it being, you know, a kind of random thing. What we've done within Certification Assistant to truly make it easy and repeatable is, you know, we collect the data once, whether it's 171 or for CMMC up to level 3. But when you press the button, bell, you know, to do your SPURS score report, it also generates your SSP either in the nomenclature of 171 if you're doing a 171, or let's say it's for a CMMC SSP. It's doing those things with the same information you collected for 171, but doing it within the domains and practices as described by the CMMC document. Now, as you said, there's no official document out there, but the assessors are going to be going through, looking at it from the nomenclature of CMMC, you know, with those identifiers. Within our product, we have all those things cross-linked, so you can see it, you know, collect it once, report out either one. But the key thing is you're going to want to keep those maintained along with your artifacts for how you did your SPURS score, especially if you get audited downstream from a prime or from the DoD, if that would happen.
Yeah,
So
Scott, that's huge value. That's really,
it's huge.
Yeah, because taking a Word document and trying to format I know some of them are 500-600 pages long for the big systems, but just trying to do word processing on a document that size, it just pull your hair out, and that's probably what happened here. But having something automated where you just fill in the, not the blanks, but fill in the sections and you auto gen all of that in a template that is easily understood. That's such a time saver and for an organization and an individual. So I highly recommend that.
Yeah, you're potentially saving hundreds and hundreds of hours, or in the case of one of those large systems, even more than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I've got a question here from an IT manager where his company has multiple cage codes for different manufacturing buildings within our campus, which is all maintained within the same enclave. So I'm assuming one enclave for the CUI data, but that's just an assumption. Do I need to register all my cage codes for SPRs, or can I use just the cage code associated with our headquarter, which is where the IT services are located? So it's kind of like a shared IT service provider across the different cage codes, so to speak. And I think I know the answer, but I'll see if I'll let you take a stab at it first.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't know if you can enter all the cage codes. If you have multiple entries, I'd enter them all. If you can only enter one, I'd enter your headquarters because it's still sufficient in my mind. And if they want more information, they can ask.
Got it. So I'll answer it, but from the perspective of how I know some of the primes are asking to collect the data. When they're doing awards, it might be specific to a one cage code. So you're going to want to be able to have, if you've got that shared service that's doing it for all those cage codes, ideally you should be able to list all your cage codes associated with that one enclave and have that reflected. I'm sure in SPRs you can do multiple cage codes. I know within our collection service we do for the primes, we can do that as well. So that's where if you need to do it, that's how you would do it. If you have multiple enclaves, one for each cage code, you'd have to list those separately within the SPRs system, I believe. All right. Here's an interesting one, and there's not an easy answer for this. When will the third-party audits start? And I assume that's for the C3 PAOs that are doing official certifications.
Yep, they will start once the DoD puts out an RFP with a CMMC requirement in it that has to be you have to get a certification prior to award. That'll start the first set of audits. But I do know they've been doing some small pilots with other government contracts to kind of try out the process. I don't have any updates on that, but they're working through trying to do a crawl, walk, run approach. So at least they have some ability to move people through the process. Once they have enough auditors to support, the hundreds, if not thousands, sets of suppliers that'll be part of these first sets of contracts. So
Yep.
There's a ways to go.
And I know they've got a couple of assessors groups that have made it through the gate. And I know the DCMA is working in along with the AB to get additional ones through.
Yep.
The one thing I'll call out though is DIBCAT started doing assessments back in 2029. And now with the DFAR rule, they call them, they've got medium assessments. So this is where the government would go in and they've got the rights to do it with the new DFAR rule from last fall into a medium assessment where they take your SSP and they do your SPRs, your DoD assessment methodology score and compare it against what your basic or self-assessment was. Or they can do what's called a high assessment, either virtual where it's remote and they look at things remotely, or they come on site. They've probably got the capability to do with DCMA maybe 200 to 400 of those a year, but I know they've also trained other branches of the service to be able to do some of those things yourself. So don't think just about getting certified for CMMC with the audits, because depending on programs that you get involved with, either as a prime or a sub, you could be targeted for an audit directly from the government, and you'll want to make sure you're got your ducks in a row in case that happens. Let me see. I've got time for just a few more. So for the SPRS score, they're trying to get some amplification on the system performance risk system, where they were recently informed that a cyber assessment entry in that system is mandated for competing on DoD contracts. And does this apply to subcontractors? And I'll let you give your thoughts, and I'll tell you what I'm hearing from the field from both subcontractors and primes.
Scott, I didn't quite hear all that. Is that, how is
So
the SPRS records being used by the DoD procurement?
How is it being used, and does it apply to subcontractors as well as prime contractors?
Correct. Yes. Um, right now, the rule as of November 30 says if you have what we know as a DFARS flow down clause passed to your contract from your customer, regardless if you're the prime or subprime within that supply chain, the answer is yes, you are legally obligated to report your SPUR score. I have had several clients that have been denied awards because they haven't filed their SPUR score. So the DoD is actually using that as a stick to get people to take action. Now we helped one customer, determine their SPUR score, and they filed it, and then they released the award. So that's absolutely important that you get that up there if you've got awards coming. The other thing that it's important is the DoD is looking at that score because you have now provided evidence to them on your security and compliance posture. And if something happens where you are considered to have lied or did something nefarious, they at least have some evidence that they could follow up with the False Claims Act. So not to scare you, but they're really starting to increase enforcement that suppliers are doing what they signed up to do, which is get secure and compliant based on having a DFARS flow down. And then with CMMC, it's all or nothing, right? They actually have a third party audit versus a self-assessment. It's important to get your SPUR score up as soon as possible and keep it updated as it improves because it does give you a competitive advantage.
Yeah, from the primes perspective, I know they are required with the new DFARS rule from last fall to inquire and verify that a subcontractor, if that clause applies to them, has done the same thing and input their score into the SPUR system. So it does apply to subcontractors. However, a prime contractor cannot go in and the SPUR system and look at somebody else's score. Only government officials can see that. So that's where you've got a lot of the primes, and some of them leverage Exostar to collect information to say, have you input your scores information? Was it for an enclave or enterprise and all those other attributes? And, tell me your cage codes it applies to. And if you're willing to share the score, do. I know there's a question where some people are asking, why are they asking us these questions or about CMMC if it's not available? I know in our questionnaire, the primes want to know when you're targeting to try to be CMMC level 3 or what target level you're going for and when you think you're going to achieve it. I know for our primes, they know it's not available. They're heavily involved with the DoD in helping manage that program, but they're trying to collect this information to do their own risk management activities, help themselves win awards because they're going to be viewed with going after prime contracts. What do their supply chains look like, and who are they associating with, and how are they managing them? So there's definitely a trust factor with suppliers that work with the primes for sharing that information, and it's really it's a national security issue where we're trying to raise the security posture of the DIB because of the nation state threats from outside. So it's a shared responsibility. It's not fun. It seems like another burden that you've got to do. We've got people reporting to the government. They report into Exostar. They probably report into some other systems for other primes, but it's something we're doing just to help, secure the DIB in general.
Yep.
One last call out, if you could do the exit poll that's in the link in the YouTube thing, that would be great. I think we've finished the questions for today. If there's additional questions, please send them in to cmmc-team.com. If you want a copy of this slide deck, it's got this information plus some additional appendix information that Jerry's provided as well. That's great information. Please reach out to us and we'll distribute that as well. If there's any additional questions that you've had come in or that you're thinking about, reach out to cmmc-team@exostar.com. Jerry's contact information is here up on the screen. If you ask for the PowerPoint, you'll get that as well. And on that note, I wish everybody well, and it's been a great session today. Let's get to work on the SSPs. Let's make it easy. Let's make a habit out of it because it's not a one-time experience. It's kind of getting on that journey to getting more secure. If you need to reach out to help from folks like Jerry and the CORTAC group, they're willing and able to help on a range of services, which I think is the right path to go. It's kind of going to take a large collection of us in the community to help secure the DIB and help these programs move forward.
Yeah, well, thank you, Scott. I hope it was educational for everybody to learn a little bit more about kind of SSPs and kind of your path forward.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
All right. Everybody have a great day.